The morning of July 14th, 1941, near the town of Orsha in Belorussia, Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner pressed his binoculars against his eyes, scanning the Soviet positions across the Dnieper River. The 29-year-old company commander from Munich had led his men through 3 weeks of seemingly unstoppable advance since Operation Barbarossa began. Behind him, 160 soldiers from the Third Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment rested in a grove of birch trees, brewing coffee and cleaning weapons. They had every reason for confidence. German forces had advanced over 400 kilometers into Soviet territory, encircled entire Soviet armies, and captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The Red Army appeared to be collapsing. Within hours, Steiner and his men would witness something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the war they were fighting. What began as routine preparation for another assault would end with over half his battalion obliterated in less than 2 minutes by a weapon system none of them had ever seen before. This wasn't just a story of tactical surprise. This was the story of how Soviet industrial desperation produced a weapon so psychologically devastating that German soldiers who survived its first use would spend the rest of the war in terror of hearing that distinctive sound. Again, the sound they called Stalin's organ, a shrieking mechanical wail that announced mass death arriving at supersonic speed. The technology behind what the Soviets called Katyusha, Little Katy, and what German soldiers would come to call Stalin's organ, represented a fascinating convergence of industrial necessity and tactical innovation. By the summer of 1941, Soviet conventional artillery production was struggling to replace catastrophic losses. German forces had captured or destroyed thousands of Soviet field guns during the opening weeks of Barbarossa. Traditional artillery pieces required precision manufacturing, skilled gun crews, months of training, and complex logistics for ammunition supply. The Soviet Union needed firepower that could be produced quickly with unskilled labor and that could compensate for the massive losses of trained artillery crews. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The solution had actually been developed years earlier by Soviet engineers exploring rocket artillery as an alternative to conventional guns. The key innovation was brilliantly simple. Instead of a single large gun firing shells one at a time, the Katyusha system consisted of multiple rocket launch rails mounted on the back of ordinary trucks. Each rocket was essentially a large firework, a steel tube filled with solid rocket fuel and an explosive warhead. The rockets were simple enough to be mass-produced in factories that had never built weapons before. The launch systems required no precision machinery, just welded steel rails that could be fabricated in any industrial workshop. The BM-13, the first operational Katyusha variant, mounted 16 launch rails on a modified ZIS-6 truck chassis. Each rail held one M13 rocket, 132 millimeters in diameter, weighing 42 kilograms, including its 22 kilogram high-explosive warhead. The rockets had no guidance system whatsoever. They were spin-stabilized by fins and fired at a fixed angle determined by manually adjusting the launch rails. Accuracy was terrible by conventional artillery standards. A single rocket might land anywhere within a circle 200 meters across at maximum range, but the Katyusha's devastating effectiveness came not from accuracy, but from saturation. When all 16 rockets fired in rapid succession, they delivered 350 kilograms of high explosive across a target area in less than 10 seconds. A battery of 4 launchers could put 64 rockets into an area the size of a football field in the time it took conventional artillery to fire a single salvo. The psychological effect was the weapon's greatest strength, something Soviet designers had anticipated but could not have fully predicted. The M13 rockets produced a distinctive sound during flight, a howling shriek caused by air flowing through the rocket nozzles. The noise was unnatural, mechanical, terrifying in a way that conventional artillery shells were not. German soldiers who survived Katyusha attacks consistently reported that the sound was worse than the explosions, that hearing those rockets incoming produced panic that no amount of training or discipline could fully suppress. Production of the Katyusha began in secret in early 1941 at the compressor plant in Moscow and at the Voronezh excavator factory. The first experimental battery, designated Battery Captain Flerov, was formed on June 28, 1941, just 6 days after Germany invaded. The battery consisted of 7 BM-13 launchers, with specially trained crews sworn to absolute secrecy. Soviet authorities understood that the psychological impact of the weapon would be maximized if its first use came as a complete surprise. German intelligence had no indication such a weapon existed. The location chosen for the weapon's combat debut was Orsha, a railway junction town in Belorussia where German forces had concentrated for a push toward Smolensk. Soviet reconnaissance had identified a German ammunition depot, vehicle park, and troop concentration in woods near the town. The target was ideal for testing the new weapon, densely packed enemy formations in an area where the Katyusha's poor accuracy wouldn't matter. Hauptmann Steiner's battalion had arrived at their assembly area on July 13th, with orders to attack Soviet positions across the Dnieper the following morning. The battalion commander, Major Klaus Reinhardt, established his headquarters in a farmhouse, while infantry companies dispersed into nearby woods. Wehrmacht logistics had positioned an ammunition depot and fuel dump approximately 800 meters behind the frontline positions, well beyond the range of Soviet conventional artillery that had been largely ineffective during the German advance. Dozens of trucks parked in neat rows, confident that Soviet air power had been neutralized and that artillery posed minimal threat. The German soldiers settling in for the night had every reason for confidence based on their experiences during the first 3 weeks of Operation Barbarossa. The advance had been spectacular. Army Group Center had advanced over 450 kilometers from the border, encircled massive Soviet forces at Minsk and Bialystok, and captured over 300,000 prisoners. The Red Army appeared to be in complete disarray. German tactical doctrine emphasized mobility, combined arms coordination, and aggressive exploitation of success. These tactics had worked brilliantly. Soviet forces seemed unable to mount coordinated defenses. What German commanders fundamentally misunderstood was that Soviet strategic doctrine accepted catastrophic initial losses as inevitable. The Soviet leadership understood that the Red Army of June 1941 was inadequate to stop the Wehrmacht in open battle. The plan was to trade space for time, allow German forces to advance deep into Soviet territory while Soviet industry evacuated eastward beyond German reach, then counterattack once new armies had been raised and equipped. The Katyusha represented exactly the kind of weapon this strategy required, something that could be mass-produced quickly, operated by minimally trained crews, and that could compensate through firepower density for deficiencies in training and tactical sophistication. On the evening of July 13th, Battery Captain Flerov moved into firing positions approximately 3 kilometers from the German concentration at Orsha. The 7 launchers took up positions along a tree line that provided concealment from German observation. Each launcher carried 16 rockets ready to fire, giving the battery a first salvo capacity of 112 rockets. Soviet fire control was crude but adequate. Forward observers had plotted German positions on maps and provided estimated coordinates. The battery commander calculated firing data by hand, adjusting launch rail angles to achieve the desired range. There were no sophisticated fire control computers, no radio communication with forward observers during the attack, just basic mathematics and maps. The Soviet crews waited through the night. Their orders were explicit: fire all rockets at the designated target area, then withdraw immediately at maximum speed. The launchers were to disperse to separate hiding positions and remain concealed until ordered to reassemble. Soviet command understood that revealing the new weapon's existence would make future surprise attacks impossible, so the first use had to be devastating enough to justify sacrificing surprise. July 14th dawned clear and warm. Hauptmann Steiner conducted his morning inspection, checking that his men were ready for the scheduled attack. The battalion was at approximately 70% strength, normal for units that had been in continuous combat for 3 weeks. Morale remained high despite casualties and fatigue. The men believed they were winning decisively, that Soviet resistance would collapse completely within weeks, that they would be home before winter. At 1415 hours, 7 Soviet BM-13 launchers opened fire simultaneously. 112 M13 rockets launched in a ripple that lasted 9 seconds. The shrieking sound began immediately as rockets accelerated to speeds exceeding 1,200 kilometers per hour. The sound, built from a whistle to a howl to a scream that overwhelmed all other noise. German soldiers 3 kilometers from the launchers heard it clearly, a sound unlike anything they had experienced before. The rockets reached their target in approximately 11 seconds. They impacted across an area roughly 300 meters by 400 meters that included the ammunition depot, vehicle park, and 2 infantry companies resting in the woods. The first rockets exploded among the parked trucks. High explosive warheads detonated with overpressure that shredded vehicles and ignited fuel tanks. Within seconds, dozens of trucks were burning. Then rockets hit the ammunition depot. The secondary explosions began almost immediately. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, rifle ammunition, grenades, all began cooking off in the fires triggered by rocket impacts. The chain reaction expanded rapidly as flames spread from one ammunition pile to another. Explosions threw shrapnel hundreds of meters in all directions. Soldiers caught in the open had no cover from the cascading detonations. In the woods where infantry companies had been resting, rockets exploded among the trees with devastating effect. The M13 warhead contained 22 kilograms of high explosive, roughly equivalent to a heavy artillery shell. But unlike artillery that arrived one round at a time, allowing soldiers to seek cover between impacts, the Katyusha's rockets arrived nearly simultaneously across the entire target area. Soldiers had no warning, no time to react, no opportunity to find shelter. The explosions came in an overwhelming wave that saturated the entire area within seconds. Hauptmann Steiner was approximately 400 meters from the impact zone when the attack began. The sound reached him first, that impossible shrieking that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He turned toward the sound, confused, trying to identify what he was hearing. Then he saw the smoke trails arcing through the sky, dozens of them, parallel lines of white smoke streaking toward his battalion's positions. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. Soviet artillery salvos didn't look like that. Artillery shells followed ballistic trajectories, single rounds arriving one after another. This was something completely different, multiple projectiles in flight simultaneously, moving faster than seemed possible. The explosions began before he could shout a warning. The sound was overwhelming. Not the sequential detonations of artillery barrage, but a continuous roar as dozens of warheads exploded within seconds of each other. The ammunition depot erupted in a massive fireball that rose hundreds of meters into the air. The vehicle park disappeared in flames and smoke. The woods where his men had been resting became an inferno of explosions and splintering trees. Steiner ran toward the impact zone, shouting orders that no one could hear over the continuing explosions. Soldiers emerged from the smoke, some wounded, many in shock, all terrified by what they had just experienced. The secondary explosions from the ammunition depot continued for over 20 minutes, making any organized response impossible. Fires raged through the vehicle park, consuming trucks and their supplies. In the woods, wounded men screamed for help while unexploded ordnance cooked off randomly, killing medics attempting rescues. When Major Reinhardt finally organized a casualty count 3 hours later, the numbers were catastrophic. 114 men killed outright, another 73 wounded, many critically. Over half the battalion's effective strength eliminated in less than 2 minutes of actual rocket fire. 37 trucks destroyed, along with approximately 60 tons of ammunition and fuel. 2 infantry companies had effectively ceased to exist as combat units. The survivors were showing signs of severe psychological trauma, flinching at every sound, unable to focus on orders, talking obsessively about the noise those rockets had made. What made the attack especially devastating was that German forces had no tactical response. Against conventional artillery, standard doctrine called for counter-battery fire, using artillery spotters and sound-ranging equipment to locate enemy guns, then destroying them with return fire. But by the time German artillery could organize a response, the Soviet launchers had vanished. The BM-13's mobility was its greatest tactical advantage. The entire battery had withdrawn within minutes of firing, dispersing to hiding positions kilometers from the launch site. German reconnaissance found only tire tracks and scorched earth where the launchers had been. The psychological impact extended far beyond the soldiers directly affected. News of the attack spread through German units with the speed of wildfire. Soldiers who hadn't witnessed the attack heard accounts from survivors that grew more terrifying with each retelling. The sound was described as demonic, inhuman, the scream of some mechanical monster. The speed and density of the barrage made survival seem like pure luck rather than skill or training. Traditional combat skills, fieldcraft, cover, discipline, offered no protection against this kind of weapon. German intelligence worked frantically to understand what had hit them. Initial reports speculated about multiple batteries of heavy artillery firing simultaneously, or perhaps some kind of aircraft-delivered munitions. The truth emerged gradually through interrogation of captured Soviet soldiers and analysis of rocket debris recovered from impact sites. What German technical experts discovered both relieved and disturbed them. The rockets themselves were crude, essentially large fireworks with minimal guidance and terrible accuracy. But the launching system was brilliantly simple, easy to produce in massive quantities, and the tactical employment maximized the weapon's psychological impact while minimizing its technical limitations. German field commanders immediately requested development of similar weapons, but German industry was already stretched, producing conventional artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The precision-focused German military-industrial complex was poorly suited to mass-producing crude but effective weapons. German rocket programs existed, but focused on developing sophisticated guided missiles rather than simple saturation systems. By the time German Nebelwerfer rocket launchers were deployed in significant numbers, Soviet Katyusha batteries had multiplied from 7 launchers to hundreds. The Orsha attack was just the beginning. Soviet industry ramped up Katyusha production with impressive speed. By September 1941, multiple batteries were operational. By December, production reached dozens of launchers monthly. The system's elegant simplicity made this possible. A typical Katyusha launcher could be built in any factory with basic welding equipment. The rockets required no precision machinery, just stamped sheet metal, solid rocket fuel, and high explosives. Assembly could be performed by workers with minimal training. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The weapon's impact on German morale became cumulative and increasingly severe as Katyusha attacks multiplied. German soldiers developed an almost superstitious dread of the distinctive sound. Veterans could identify Katyusha fire instantly and would dive for cover at the first hint of that shrieking howl, even when the rockets were targeting positions hundreds of meters away. Officers reported increasing difficulty maintaining unit cohesion under Katyusha bombardment, as soldiers would break and run regardless of orders or threats. The evolution of Soviet tactical doctrine around the Katyusha demonstrated learning from battlefield experience. Initial attacks like Orsha used the element of surprise to achieve maximum psychological impact. Later attacks employed Katyusha barrages as preparation for infantry assaults, using the weapon's psychological effect to break German defensive positions before Soviet troops attacked. The typical pattern became standardized. A devastating Katyusha barrage lasting 2 to 3 minutes that would saturate the target area with hundreds of rockets, followed immediately by infantry assault, while German defenders were still disoriented and scattered. German defensive doctrine evolved in response. Units learned to disperse more widely, avoiding the concentrated positions that made ideal Katyusha targets. Improved reconnaissance attempted to locate and destroy Katyusha batteries before they could fire. German counter-battery fire became faster and more aggressive, but these adaptations could only mitigate, not eliminate, the weapon's effectiveness. The fundamental problem was that the Katyusha's mobility and the speed of its fire mission made it nearly impossible to destroy before it could withdraw. By late 1941, as German forces bogged down outside Moscow in winter conditions they were unprepared for, Katyusha attacks became part of the psychological landscape of the Eastern Front. The sound became associated with major Soviet attacks, with breakthrough attempts, with critical battles. German situation reports routinely noted heavy Stalin organ fire as a factor in combat operations. Medical officers documented increasing cases of combat stress related specifically to Katyusha bombardment, soldiers who could function under conventional artillery fire but who became non-functional when exposed to rocket attacks. The industrial dimension of the Katyusha story reveals much about why the Soviet Union ultimately prevailed on the Eastern Front. While German industry struggled with resource shortages, strategic bombing, and Hitler's often counterproductive interference in weapons development, Soviet industry evacuated entire factories eastward beyond German reach and continued expanding production of weapons that were effective, even if crude. The Katyusha exemplified this approach. Simple enough to mass produce, effective enough to compensate for tactical deficiencies, psychologically devastating enough to multiply its material impact. Production numbers tell the story. By the end of 1942, Soviet industry had produced approximately 3,000 Katyusha launchers of various models. By 1944, production exceeded 10,000 launchers annually. Total production during the war approached 30,000 launchers. Each launcher could deliver a complete salvo in under 10 seconds, then reload in approximately 5 minutes if ammunition trucks were positioned nearby. A Guards Katyusha battalion at full strength in 1944 fielded 36 launchers, organized in 3 batteries, capable of firing 576 rockets in a single salvo. The mathematics of firepower density were staggering. A single Katyusha battalion, firing a full salvo, delivered roughly 12 tons of high explosive across its target area in approximately 10 seconds. For comparison, a conventional German artillery battalion might deliver 1 ton of high explosive in a minute-long barrage. The Katyusha's firepower advantage was roughly 12-1 in terms of explosive delivered per unit time. This advantage compensated for numerous disadvantages in accuracy, range, and ammunition efficiency. The weapon's psychological impact derived partly from its sound, but also from the randomness of its effect. Conventional artillery barrages followed patterns that experienced soldiers could predict. After the ranging shots, there would be a concentration on specific targets, then a shift to different coordinates. Soldiers learned to identify covered positions, to move during lulls in fire, to anticipate where shells would land based on sound and experience. Katyusha fire offered no such predictability. The rockets arrived in a near-simultaneous wave across a broad area. There was no ranging, no pattern, no safe spot. Survival depended on luck rather than skill, and this randomness was psychologically corrosive in ways that conventional artillery was not. German attempts to develop countermeasures met with limited success. The Luftwaffe attempted to target Katyusha batteries from the air, but Soviet air defenses and the launcher's mobility made this difficult. German ground forces occasionally captured Katyusha units through rapid advances, but the Soviets quickly learned to position launchers further behind front lines and to improve security around battery positions. German signals intelligence intercepted some Soviet fire control communications, providing warning of imminent attacks, but the warning time was rarely sufficient for units to disperse before rockets arrived. One German adaptation proved effective, but required resources that were increasingly scarce. Motorized units with good reconnaissance and rapid mobility could sometimes locate Katyusha batteries during their vulnerable reload period and close quickly enough to destroy them before they could withdraw. This required precise intelligence, fast-moving armor or motorized infantry, and excellent coordination. As German mobility degraded due to fuel shortages and vehicle losses, even this tactic became impractical. The experience of Hauptmann Steiner and the survivors of Orsha became representative of thousands of similar incidents across the Eastern Front during the war's final 4 years. Steiner himself survived the war, though he was wounded twice more and witnessed countless additional Katyusha attacks. In post-war interviews conducted in the 1950s, he spoke candidly about how that first attack at Orsha had affected him. He described the attack as the moment he first doubted that Germany could win the war. Not because of the casualties, which while heavy were not unprecedented, but because of what the weapon revealed about Soviet industrial capacity and tactical doctrine. The Soviets, Steiner explained, had developed a weapon that accepted poor accuracy and inefficiency in exchange for mass production and psychological impact. This was fundamentally different from German approaches that emphasized technical sophistication and precision. The German military had designed weapons to be operated by skilled personnel, maintained by trained technicians, employed according to complex doctrine. The Katyusha could be operated by a truck driver with basic training, maintained with ordinary tools, and employed through simple fire missions that required minimal coordination. The strategic implications were profound. Germany was trying to fight a war of quality against an enemy whose entire approach was organized around quantity. And quantity, Steiner concluded, was winning. Soviet strategic doctrine explicitly incorporated lessons learned from Katyusha employment. The weapon demonstrated that crude but numerous systems could be more effective than sophisticated but scarce systems when employed against an enemy with limited ability to replace losses. German forces in 1941 had excellent equipment and training but limited strategic reserves. Every German battalion destroyed required months to reconstitute. Soviet forces had inferior equipment and training but essentially unlimited manpower reserves and rapidly expanding industrial production. Trading sophisticated German units for crude but numerous Soviet attacks was strategically favorable for the Soviets. The Katyusha also demonstrated the importance of psychological warfare in industrial age combat. The weapon's material effect was significant but not revolutionary. Conventional artillery could deliver similar amounts of explosive to target areas, though less rapidly. What made the Katyusha truly devastating was its psychological impact, the terror it induced in enemy soldiers. This terror degraded German combat effectiveness beyond the simple casualty counts. Units that survived Katyusha attacks without major losses still showed reduced combat effectiveness for days afterward. Officers reported difficulty maintaining discipline. Soldiers showed signs of combat fatigue after relatively brief exposure. The cumulative psychological impact over years of warfare was incalculable, but certainly substantial. By 1943, as the strategic initiative shifted decisively to the Soviets, Katyusha units became integral to major offensive operations. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 saw the largest concentration of rocket artillery ever assembled. Soviet fronts defending against the German offensive deployed over 800 Katyusha launchers. The preparatory bombardments for Soviet counter-offensives following Kursk routinely included massed Katyusha fire. German after-action reports from this period consistently noted the devastating effectiveness of Soviet rocket artillery, describing it as one of the most significant Soviet tactical advantages. The weapon's evolution continued throughout the war. The original BM-13 mounted on ZIS-6 trucks was supplemented by heavier systems. The BM-31 mounted 36 launch rails on a Studebaker truck chassis provided by American Lend-Lease, doubling the first salvo firepower of a single launcher. The BM-1316 on the back of the heavy-duty Mack truck could fire 16 of the larger M31 rockets, each with a 50-kilogram warhead. Specialized ammunition included incendiary rockets for attacking fortifications and smoke rockets for screening operations. By war's end, Soviet rocket artillery had evolved into a comprehensive family of systems optimized for different tactical roles. The industrial achievement, represented by Katyusha production, deserves emphasis. Soviet industry, while evacuating entire factories thousands of kilometers eastward under German aerial attack, simultaneously expanded production of a new weapon system from 0 to thousands of units annually. This occurred while Soviet industry was also producing tanks, aircraft, artillery, small arms, ammunition, and all the other materiel needed to equip an army that grew from approximately 3 million men in June 1941 to over 6 million by 1943. The organizational capacity required to accomplish this industrial mobilization while simultaneously fighting a war of national survival was extraordinary. German intelligence assessments of Soviet industrial capacity consistently underestimated Soviet production capabilities. German planners had assumed Soviet industry would collapse under the loss of territory in the war's first months. Instead, Soviet industry relocated and expanded. German assessments assumed Soviet weapons would be crude and ineffective. The Katyusha was indeed crude by German engineering standards, but it was devastatingly effective. The German military's focus on technical sophistication blinded it to the strategic advantages of simpler systems produced in larger quantities. The post-war period saw extensive analysis of the Katyusha's strategic impact. Soviet military theorists cited it as validation of their doctrine, emphasizing mass and simplicity over precision and sophistication. Western analysts recognized it as an example of how industrial capacity could be weaponized through appropriate design philosophy. Military forces worldwide developed their own rocket artillery systems based partly on lessons learned from Soviet employment of the Katyusha. Modern multiple-launch rocket systems like the American M270 MLRS trace their conceptual lineage directly to the Soviet innovations of 1941. The human dimension of the Katyusha story extends beyond combat effectiveness to the workers who built these weapons. Soviet factory workers, many of them women and teenagers whose husbands and fathers were at the front, worked extraordinary hours under harsh conditions to produce the weapons that would defend their country. The simplicity of Katyusha production made this possible. Workers with minimal training could contribute to manufacturing rockets and launchers. The sense of direct contribution to the war effort sustained morale through terrible hardships. For German soldiers, the Katyusha became synonymous with the seemingly inexhaustible material power of the Soviet war machine. No matter how many launchers were destroyed, more appeared. No matter how many rockets were fired, ammunition supplies never seemed to diminish. This endless material superiority gradually eroded German confidence that skill and courage could overcome numerical inferiority. The realization that Germany was fighting an enemy with greater industrial capacity, greater manpower reserves, and a doctrine optimized to exploit these advantages contributed to the psychological collapse of German resistance in the war's final years. The final Soviet offensive operations in 1945 employed Katyusha fire on scales that would have been unimaginable in 1941. The January 1945 Vistula-Oder offensive that carried Soviet forces from Poland to within striking distance of Berlin began with artillery preparation that included fire from over 7,000 rocket launchers. The bombardment delivered an estimated 250,000 tons of high explosive across German defensive positions in the war's opening hours. German survivors described the experience as apocalyptic, a mechanical storm of fire and steel that simply annihilated defensive positions across vast areas. The Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945 saw Katyusha units firing directly into the city from close range, adding to the devastation already inflicted by conventional artillery and aerial bombing. The psychological impact of rocket fire on German defenders, many of them hastily trained Volkssturm militia or Hitler Youth, was overwhelming. Units broke and fled despite orders to fight to the death. The weapon that had first appeared at Orsha in July 1941 completed its evolution into a symbol of Soviet material superiority and German defeat. The story of how German tactical doctrine attempted to adapt to the Katyusha threat reveals the fundamental strategic mismatch that characterized the entire Eastern Front campaign. German military thinking emphasized maneuver, concentration of force, and the decisive battle. These principles had worked brilliantly in Poland and France, where concentrated armor formations supported by tactical air power could achieve breakthrough and encirclement. But the Katyusha represented a weapon specifically designed to counter concentration. Any gathering of German forces, any assembly area, any concentration of vehicles or troops became an ideal target for saturation rocket fire. Oberst Wilhelm Hauptmann, a staff officer with the Fourth Army during the advance on Moscow, documented in his war diary the escalating frustration German commanders felt as Katyusha attacks multiplied through late 1941. Hauptmann recorded that divisional and corps commanders began spacing their units more widely, dispersing supply dumps, and avoiding obvious assembly areas. These adaptations reduced vulnerability to rocket fire, but also reduced tactical effectiveness. Dispersed units took longer to concentrate for attacks. Scattered supply dumps required more transportation to distribute materiel. The requirement to disperse created friction that slowed German operations precisely when speed was essential. The winter of 1941–42 brought a cascade of disasters that overshadowed the Katyusha threat but were partly caused by it. The Soviet counter-offensive that began in December 1941 caught German forces that were already overstretched, undersupplied, and psychologically exhausted. Katyusha fire preceded most Soviet attacks during this period, softening German defensive positions and shattering the morale of soldiers already suffering from inadequate winter clothing, frostbite, and the realization that the war would not end quickly. German casualty reports from this period routinely noted that units subjected to heavy rocket fire before Soviet infantry assaults showed significantly higher rates of surrender and breakdown than units that faced only conventional artillery. The psychological dimension of Katyusha fire became a subject of study for German military psychiatrists attempting to understand and treat combat stress. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a Wehrmacht medical officer who treated soldiers at a field hospital near Smolensk in 1942, wrote extensively about what he called Stalin-Orgel syndrome, a specific pattern of symptoms he observed in soldiers exposed to repeated rocket attacks. The symptoms included hypervigilance, startle responses to any sudden sound, nightmares featuring the distinctive shrieking of incoming rockets, and a fatalistic belief that survival was purely random and beyond individual control. What made Stalin-Orgel syndrome particularly debilitating was that it undermined the psychological foundations of military discipline. Soldiers are trained to believe that following orders, maintaining position, and executing tactics will improve their chances of survival. The Katyusha's area saturation and near-simultaneous arrival of dozens of rockets meant that tactical skill had minimal influence on survival. A soldier in perfect cover might be killed by a rocket that happened to land nearby, while a soldier in the open might survive because no rockets happened to hit his position. This randomness eroded the belief that military training and discipline mattered, which in turn made soldiers less responsive to orders and less willing to remain in dangerous positions. German attempts to capture intact Katyusha systems met with mixed success. Soviet crews were under strict orders to destroy their launchers rather than allow capture. The standard procedure, when a battery was in danger of being overrun, was to fire any remaining rockets regardless of target availability, then use thermite grenades or explosives to destroy the launchers. Despite these measures, German forces did occasionally capture damaged or abandoned systems. Technical intelligence teams examined these captures carefully, sending detailed reports to Berlin about the weapons' construction and capabilities. What German engineers discovered both impressed and disturbed them. The Katyusha was mechanically crude, with tolerances that would have been unacceptable in German production. The rockets themselves showed evidence of hasty manufacture, with rough welds and simple components, yet the system worked, effectively within its design parameters. This realization highlighted a fundamental difference in design philosophy. German weapons emphasized precision and reliability under all conditions. Soviet weapons accepted lower reliability and precision in exchange for much higher production rates. A German artillery piece might fire 10,000 rounds without malfunction, while a Katyusha launcher might fail after a few hundred rounds. But the Soviets could produce 10 Katyusha launchers for every German artillery piece, making the trade-off strategically favorable. The summer campaign of 1942 brought new challenges as German forces advanced towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. Katyusha units had multiplied, and their tactical employment had become more sophisticated. Soviet commanders learned to coordinate rocket fire with conventional artillery, combining the psychological impact of Katyusha salvos with the precision of gun artillery. The typical fire plan would begin with a Katyusha barrage to suppress German positions and induce panic, followed immediately by precision artillery fire on specific strongpoints, then another Katyusha salvo as Soviet infantry began their assault. This combination proved devastatingly effective. At Stalingrad, Katyusha units played a crucial role in the Soviet defense and subsequent counteroffensive. The close-quarters urban fighting limited the weapon's effectiveness somewhat, as the minimum range of approximately 1 kilometer meant launchers had to fire from positions well behind front lines. But during the Soviet counteroffensive Operation Uranus that encircled the German Sixth Army in November 1942, massed Katyusha fire tore through Romanian positions, defending the flanks of the German salient. Romanian troops, equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking the combat experience of German units, broke under rocket bombardment more readily than German forces. The breakthrough that led to the Kotinit, the encirclement of over 200,000 German soldiers, was achieved partly through the psychological shock of massed rocket fire against units already demoralized and poorly supplied. General-Lieutenant Arthur Schmidt, Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the 6th Army at Stalingrad, later described the Soviet bombardment preceding Operation Uranus as unlike anything he had experienced in 2 world wars. Schmidt had served as an artillery officer during World War I and had witnessed the massive bombardments on the Western Front. He stated that the Soviet rocket fire at Stalingrad exceeded even the heaviest World War I barrages in terms of density and psychological impact. The fact that this assessment came from an experienced artillery officer who understood conventional bombardment highlighted how fundamentally different Katyusha fire was from traditional artillery. The encirclement and eventual destruction of the 6th Army at Stalingrad marked a turning point, not just strategically, but psychologically. German soldiers who had believed in inevitable victory now understood they faced an enemy with superior resources and industrial capacity. The Katyusha became a symbol of this superiority, a weapon that could be produced in quantities Germany could not match and employed in ways Germany could not counter. When news of Stalingrad reached German forces elsewhere on the Eastern Front, it came accompanied by accounts of overwhelming Soviet firepower, and the Katyusha featured prominently in these accounts. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front and demonstrated how completely Soviet doctrine had integrated rocket artillery. The Germans concentrated over 2,000 tanks and nearly 1 million men for Operation Citadel, intending to pinch off the Kursk salient and regain operational initiative. Soviet intelligence learned of the offensive weeks in advance, allowing extensive preparation. Soviet defensive preparations included positioning over 800 Katyusha launchers in carefully concealed positions behind defensive lines. On July 5, 1943, as German forces began their assault, they encountered defensive fire of unprecedented density. Soviet conventional artillery had been positioned in massive concentrations, sometimes exceeding 200 guns per kilometre of front. But it was the Katyusha fire that German participants remembered most vividly. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schneider, commanding a panzer company in the 3rd Panzer Division, described the opening hours of the offensive in a letter written weeks later to his brother. Schneider wrote that his company had advanced barely 3 kilometres when Soviet rocket fire began. The sound was overwhelming, he wrote, like thousands of demons screaming at once. The explosions came in waves that seemed to last for minutes, though the actual barrage lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, 5 of his company's 14 tanks were burning, and most of the accompanying infantry had gone to ground and could not be rallied for over an hour. The cumulative effect of massive Soviet artillery preparation, dense minefields, deep defensive positions, and the psychological impact of rocket fire broke the German offensive at Kursk. After a week of fighting that inflicted horrific casualties on both sides, the Germans had achieved only limited penetrations of Soviet defences and had exhausted their offensive capability. The Soviets then launched counter-offensives that would continue almost uninterrupted until German forces were pushed back to Poland. Katyusha fire preceded almost every Soviet attack during this advance, becoming as much a signature of Soviet offensive operations as the Stuka dive bomber had been of German offensives in 1940 and 41. The evolution of Katyusha tactics through 1943 and 44 showed Soviet military learning at operational and strategic levels. Early attacks had used the weapon primarily for its shock value, firing at area targets with minimal coordination with other arms. By 1944, rocket artillery was fully integrated into combined arms operations. Fire plans specified exactly when Katyusha salvos would be delivered relative to conventional artillery fire, infantry assault timing, and armor exploitation. Soviet commanders learned to use rocket fire to suppress specific types of targets. Area targets like assembly areas and supply depots received saturation fire from multiple batteries. Linear targets, like defensive lines, received walking barrages where successive salvos marched across terrain. Hardened targets, like bunker complexes, received precision conventional artillery fire, supplemented by rocket fire to suppress surrounding positions. The scale of Soviet rocket artillery employment reached levels that would have seemed impossible in 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the massive Soviet offensive in Belorussia in June 1944 that destroyed German Army Group Center, employed over 2,000 Katyusha launchers. The preparatory bombardment on June 23 delivered an estimated 40,000 tons of high explosive across German positions in less than 3 hours. German survivors described the experience as apocalyptic. Feldwebel Anton Becker, whose regiment was virtually annihilated in the opening hours of Bagration, wrote in a letter smuggled from captivity that the rocket fire was so dense that explosions merged into a continuous roar that lasted for over an hour. The entire horizon seemed to be exploding simultaneously, he wrote. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Men simply crouched in their foxholes and prayed that nothing would land directly on them. The psychological collapse of German resistance during Bagration had multiple causes, but the overwhelming firepower concentration broke German units before Soviet ground forces even attacked. Entire divisions reported combat ineffective due to casualties, disorganization, and psychological breakdown before Soviet infantry crossed the start line. German commanders attempting to organize counterattacks found their units unwilling or unable to execute orders. Communications broke down as command posts were destroyed or abandoned. The careful German defensive planning that had absorbed Soviet offensives earlier in the war simply fell apart under the weight of firepower that exceeded anything previously experienced. For individual German soldiers, the experience of being targeted by Katyusha fire remained traumatic, regardless of how many times they survived it. Unlike conventional artillery, where veteran soldiers developed techniques for estimating danger and identifying covered positions, rocket fire offered no such adaptation. The sound remained terrifying regardless of experience. The randomness of impact meant that survival always felt like luck rather than skill. This inability to develop effective coping mechanisms meant that the psychological impact of Katyusha fire was cumulative. Soldiers became more sensitized rather than desensitized with repeated exposure. German medical records from the war's final 2 years show increasing rates of combat stress related specifically to artillery fire, with Katyusha fire mentioned disproportionately, often given that it represented only a fraction of total Soviet artillery employment. Medical officers noted that soldiers could often describe in detail the sound of incoming Katyusha rockets weeks or months after exposure, suggesting that the auditory memory was particularly persistent. Some soldiers developed phobic responses, becoming unable to function effectively under any kind of artillery fire after exposure to rocket attacks. The industrial dimension of the Katyusha story reached its peak in 1944 when Soviet production of rocket, launchers and ammunition exceeded even the massive scale of earlier years. Soviet factories were producing approximately 1,200 BM-13 launchers monthly by mid-1944, along with thousands of the heavier BM-31 systems. Rocket ammunition production exceeded 1 million rounds monthly. The industrial effort required to sustain this production, while simultaneously producing tanks, aircraft, artillery, small arms, and all other military equipment, demonstrated organizational capacity that the Germans had fundamentally underestimated before the war. The strategic implications were clear to German commanders by late 1944. Germany was fighting an industrial war against an enemy with vastly superior industrial capacity. Every German weapon destroyed or expended required increasingly scarce resources to replace. Soviet losses were replaced rapidly from production that seemed inexhaustible. The Katyusha exemplified this asymmetry. Soviet losses of rocket launchers and ammunition trucks were replaced within days or weeks. German losses of precision artillery pieces took months to replace, if they were replaced at all. The cumulative effect was that Soviet firepower advantage increased throughout the war, even as German forces became more experienced and tactically proficient. The final Soviet offensives in 1945 employed rocket artillery in concentrations that represented the ultimate expression of the weapon's design philosophy. Quantity had indeed become a quality of its own. The Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945 that pushed from Poland to within striking distance of Berlin began with preparatory fire from approximately 7,000 rocket launchers, supplemented by over 30,000 conventional artillery pieces. The bombardment lasted over 2 hours and delivered a quantity of high explosive that exceeded anything previously seen in warfare. German defensive positions were simply obliterated. Survivors described being buried alive by explosions, entire bunker systems collapsing, communications destroyed, command and control impossible. The battle for Berlin in April and May 1945 saw Katyusha units firing into the city from positions on the outskirts. The urban environment limited tactical effectiveness somewhat, but the psychological impact on defenders remained severe. German troops, many of them hastily trained Volkssturm militia or teenagers from the Hitler Youth, broke and fled under rocket bombardment, despite fanatical Nazi propaganda about fighting to the last man. The weapon that had first appeared as a surprise at Orsha in July 1941 played a role in the final destruction of the Third Reich 4 years later. The post-war analysis of the Katyusha's strategic impact produced consensus among military theorists from multiple nations. The weapon represented successful weaponization of industrial capacity through appropriate design, philosophy. Its development and employment validated Soviet military doctrine, emphasizing mass and simplicity over precision and sophistication. For Western analysts, the Katyusha demonstrated that crude but numerous systems could be strategically superior to sophisticated but scarce systems when employed against an enemy with limited ability to replace losses. The human cost of Katyusha employment was staggering on both sides. Soviet rocket artillery units suffered high casualty rates when German forces successfully located and attacked battery positions. The crew's minimal training meant they were vulnerable to German infantry or armor that closed rapidly. But Soviet doctrine accepted these casualties as part of the weapon's employment, calculating that the impact on German forces justified the losses of rocket artillery crews. German casualties from rocket fire are impossible to calculate precisely, but German medical records and unit reports suggest that tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded by Katyusha attacks during the war. The psychological casualties, soldiers rendered combat ineffective by exposure to rocket fire, likely numbered even higher, though records are incomplete. For Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, who survived the war despite multiple wounds and years of combat, the memory of that first Katyusha attack at Orsha remained the most vivid of his war experiences. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, Steiner spoke about how that attack had changed his understanding of the war. Before Orsha, he had believed German tactical superiority and training would prevail over Soviet numerical advantages. The Katyusha demonstrated that Soviet industrial capacity could produce weapons that negated German tactical advantages. A weapon simple enough to be mass-produced, crude enough to be operated by minimally trained crews, but devastating enough to break German units, regardless of training or discipline, represented a form of warfare Germany could not counter. The lessons learned from Soviet employment of rocket artillery influenced post-war military development worldwide. American, British, and French forces developed their own multiple launch rocket systems based partly on analysis of Soviet experience. The recognition that area saturation fire had strategic value distinct from precision fire led to doctrine that integrated both types of artillery. Modern armies employ both precision-guided munitions for specific high-value targets and multiple launch rocket systems for area suppression, accepting that different tactical situations require different fire support approaches. The Katyusha's legacy extends beyond its direct military impact to its role in Soviet national memory and propaganda. The weapon became a symbol of Soviet industrial achievement and military innovation. Soviet films, literature, and art frequently featured Katyusha units as representations of the Red Army's strength. The weapon's nickname, Little Katy, reflected affection that contrasted with the terror it induced in enemies. This dual identity, beloved by Soviets and feared by Germans, made it an ideal propaganda symbol that could represent both Soviet technical achievement and military power. For German soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front, the Katyusha remained a symbol of the overwhelming material superiority they had faced. Veterans' accounts consistently emphasized the psychological impact of the weapon, describing it as more terrifying than conventional artillery, despite producing similar physical effects. The distinctive sound, the suddenness of the barrage, the area saturation that made cover seem futile, all contributed to a form of terror that conventional weapons did not produce. This terror was cumulative, building with each exposure until it became a defining feature of combat experience on the Eastern Front. The final assessment of the Katyusha's strategic impact must acknowledge both its material and psychological effects. Materially, the weapon delivered firepower more rapidly than conventional artillery, though with lower accuracy and efficiency. This rapid delivery created tactical advantages in preparing for assaults and disrupting enemy concentrations. Psychologically, the weapon's distinctive sound and area saturation produced terror disproportionate to its casualty-causing potential. This psychological impact degraded German combat effectiveness beyond simple attrition of personnel and equipment. The combination of material and psychological effects made the Katyusha one of the war's most significant weapon systems, despite its technical crudity. The story that began at Orsha in July 1941, with Hauptmann Steiner watching in disbelief as shrieking rockets destroyed half his battalion, represents a larger narrative about how industrial capacity shapes military outcomes. The Katyusha succeeded not because it was technically superior to German weapons, but because Soviet industrial organization and tactical doctrine were optimized to produce and employ weapons that matched Soviet strengths with German vulnerabilities. This optimization, rather than any single technical innovation, explains Soviet victory in the industrial war on the Eastern Front. The weapon that German soldiers called Stalin's organ became the instrument through which Soviet industrial might announced its presence on the battlefield, with a shriek that announced death arriving at supersonic speed. The winter of 1945 brought the final chapter of the Katyusha's wartime story. But for the soldiers who had survived years of exposure to its terror, the psychological scars would last far longer than the physical wounds. General Major Hans von Luck, commanding remnants of the 21st Panzer Division during the final retreat into Germany, recorded in his memoirs a telling incident from February 1945 that illustrated how completely the weapon had infiltrated the German soldiers' psyche. Von Luck's division was attempting to establish defensive positions along the Oder River, Germany's last significant natural barrier before Berlin. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly, and von Luck knew that a major assault was imminent. What struck him during this period was not the tactical situation, which was obviously hopeless, but the behavior of his men when they heard any sound remotely similar to Katyusha rockets, a truck backfiring, the whistle of wind through damaged buildings, even the sound of German Nebelwerfer rockets being fired by adjacent units, would cause experienced soldiers to flinch or dive for cover. These were veterans who had survived years of combat, men who had faced Soviet tanks at point-blank range, who had fought in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front winters, who had endured conditions that would have broken lesser soldiers. Yet the mere suggestion of that distinctive shrieking sound could produce panic, reactions that years of discipline could not suppress. The phenomenon von Luck observed was widespread among German forces in the war's final months. Military psychiatrists attempting to treat combat stress cases found that auditory triggers related to Katyusha fire were among the most persistent and difficult symptoms to address. Unlike visual memories that could fade or be rationalized, the sound memory remained vivid and intrusive. Soldiers described hearing the rockets in their sleep, waking in terror from dreams where the shrieking filled the world. Some reported that years after the war, unexpected loud noises would trigger immediate physical reactions, diving for cover, or experiencing panic attacks, as if their bodies retained muscle memory of responding to that sound. The Soviet employment of Katyusha fire during the final battles for German territory reflected the complete maturation of tactical doctrine around the weapon. By early 1945, Soviet Guards Katyusha regiments operated with precision that would have been impossible in 1941. Each regiment fielded 108 launchers, organized into 3 battalions of 36 launchers each. Fire control had been standardized with detailed tables for calculating range and deflection. Communications between forward observers and battery positions used coded signals that allowed rapid response to target identification. The entire system, from target acquisition to first rounds on target, could be executed in under 10 minutes, faster than conventional artillery could achieve similar effects. The integration of Katyusha fire with other arms had become seamless. A typical Soviet assault in early 1945 would begin with Katyusha salvos targeting German artillery positions and command posts. The rocket's area effect was ideal for suppressing German counter-battery fire and disrupting command and control. Immediately following the rocket barrage, conventional artillery would deliver precision fire on identified strongpoints and fortified positions. Then, a second wave of Katyusha fire would saturate forward defensive positions just before Soviet infantry began their assault. Tank units would advance during this final barrage, timing their movement so they reached German positions as the rocket fire lifted. The coordination was sophisticated enough that Soviet tanks would sometimes advance to within 500 meters of German lines, while Katyusha salvos landed just ahead of them, using the explosions as a moving barrage to cover their approach. German defenders facing these tactics described a sense of helplessness that went beyond simple military inferiority. Lieutenant Karl Weber, commanding an infantry platoon defending a village outside Frankfurt and der Oder in March 1945, wrote in a final letter to his family about the impossibility of maintaining organized defense under such bombardment. Weber described how his platoon's positions had been carefully prepared with interlocking fields of fire, alternate positions, and communication trenches. On paper, his 40 men should have been able to hold against a Soviet company attack, but when the Katyusha barrage began, all planning became irrelevant. The explosions collapsed trenches, severed communications, and scattered his men across a wide area. By the time Soviet infantry arrived, Weber's platoon had ceased to exist as a coherent unit. Individual soldiers were fighting from isolated positions with no coordination or mutual support. The battle lasted less than an hour. Weber was among the survivors who surrendered rather than die defending positions that had already been rendered useless by rocket fire. The strategic implications of such tactical dominance extended beyond individual battles to the collapse of German defensive planning. German doctrine called for defense in depth, with forward positions designed to slow attacks while reserves maneuvered to counter-attack penetrations. But Katyusha fire made this doctrine unworkable. Forward positions could be saturated and destroyed before reserves could react. The time required to identify a penetration, order reserves forward, and execute a counterattack exceeded the time required for Soviet forces to break through rocket-suppressed positions and advance beyond the range where counterattacks could be effective. German commanders found themselves consistently behind the tactical timeline, responding to situations that had already evolved beyond their ability to influence. The ammunition expenditure rates of Soviet rocket artillery during the final offensives reached levels that illustrated the complete dominance of Soviet logistics over German capabilities. During the Battle of Berlin, Soviet forces fired an estimated 1.8 million artillery rounds of all types in the battle's first 2 weeks. Katyusha rockets accounted for approximately 20% of this total, roughly 360,000 rockets. This expenditure represented more Katyusha ammunition fired in 2 weeks than Germany had produced total artillery ammunition of all types during the same period. The disparity was so extreme that comparison became almost meaningless. Germany was not just losing the war. Germany was being buried under an avalanche of materiel it had no capacity to match or counter. The individual stories of Katyusha crews provide perspective on the human dimension of this industrial firepower. Sergeant Ivan Petrov commanded a BM-13 launcher in the 3rd Guards Katyusha Regiment during the advance into Germany. Petrov had joined the Red Army in 1942 at age 19, after his village in Ukraine was liberated from German occupation. His entire family had been killed during the occupation, giving him motivation beyond simple patriotic duty. Petrov's battery participated in dozens of fire missions during the advance from Poland to Berlin, firing hundreds of salvos that delivered thousands of rockets onto German positions. In memoirs written decades after the war, Petrov described the intense satisfaction he felt each time his launcher fired. The roar of 16 rockets igniting simultaneously, the truck shaking from the thrust, the smoke and flame, the knowledge that each rocket carried death to the invaders who had destroyed his family and his country. Petrov's account was matter-of-fact about the weapon's purpose. He expressed no remorse for German casualties, no moral ambivalence about the terror his weapon induced. For Petrov and millions of Soviet soldiers who had witnessed German atrocities during the occupation, the Katyusha was an instrument of justice as much as a weapon of war. This psychological dimension of Soviet employment of the Katyusha added another layer to its effectiveness. Soviet crews were highly motivated, often by personal losses or witnessed atrocities, to inflict maximum damage on German forces. This motivation translated into aggressive tactical employment and acceptance of risks that more cautious crews might have avoided. Soviet batteries would sometimes fire from positions dangerously close to front lines to achieve surprise, accepting vulnerability to German counterfire in exchange for tactical advantage. This willingness to accept risk multiplied the weapon's effectiveness by making Soviet rocket artillery unpredictable and difficult to counter. The technological evolution of the Katyusha continued even in the war's final months. Soviet industry introduced the BM-3112, mounting 12 of the heavy 300mm M31 rockets on a Studebaker US-6 truck chassis. Each rocket weighed 92 kilograms with a 48-kilogram warhead, more than doubling the explosive power of the standard M13 rocket. The BM-3112 had been designed specifically for destroying fortifications and hardened positions. During the Battle of Berlin, these heavy systems proved devastatingly effective against German defensive positions built into buildings and bunkers. The massive warheads could collapse entire buildings with single hits, burying defenders in rubble. The final assault on Berlin saw the largest concentration of rocket artillery ever assembled for a single operation. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front, attacking Berlin from the east, deployed over 1,700 Katyusha launchers. Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front, attacking from the southeast, deployed over 900 launchers. The combined firepower represented capacity to deliver over 40,000 rockets in a single salvo, approximately 880 tons of high explosive, arriving across German positions in under 15 seconds. The preparatory bombardment for the assault on Berlin's outer defences employed approximately 60% of this capacity, delivering sustained rocket fire for over 40 minutes that transformed German defensive lines into cratered wasteland. German defenders of Berlin included a mixture of Wehrmacht remnants, Waffen-SS units, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth members. The younger defenders, many of them teenagers with minimal training and obsolete weapons, broke almost immediately under Katyusha fire. Survivors described boys as young as 14 or 15, attempting to man defensive positions, then fleeing in terror when rocket barrages began. The Nazi propaganda they had been fed about fighting heroically for the fatherland evaporated when confronted with the reality of modern industrial warfare. Many simply abandoned their weapons and tried to hide or surrender at the first opportunity. The more experienced Wehrmacht and SS units held longer, but with diminishing effectiveness as the battle progressed. Exhaustion, ammunition shortages, lack of heavy weapons, and the relentless Soviet pressure gradually degraded even elite units. The psychological impact of constant Katyusha fire contributed significantly to this degradation. Units that might have held positions for days under conventional artillery broke after hours when subjected to repeated rocket barrages. The cumulative stress of knowing that at any moment the shrieking might begin again, that there was no defense except luck, wore down even hardened veterans until they could no longer function effectively. The battle for the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany, illustrated the Katyusha's tactical employment in urban warfare. Soviet forces brought launchers to within 1 kilometer of the building, firing directly at its upper floors to suppress German defenders. The rocket's area effect was less efficient in urban terrain, where buildings absorbed much of the blast, but the psychological impact remained severe. German defenders reported that the combination of rocket fire, conventional artillery, and direct fire from Soviet tanks made holding interior positions almost impossible. The building's eventual capture on May 2, 1945, came after days of fighting where Soviet firepower gradually ground down German resistance through sheer volume of explosive delivered. Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30th occurred in a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, while Soviet Katyusha rockets exploded on the streets above. The weapon that had first appeared as a surprise at Orsha in July 1941 was present at the end. Its distinctive shriek, part of the soundtrack to Nazi Germany's final hours, the symmetry was lost on no one. The war that Germany had started with expectations of quick victory through superior tactics and equipment had ended with Germany buried under the industrial might of enemies it had underestimated. The Katyusha symbolized this reversal, a crude weapon that had defeated German technical sophistication through mass production and ruthless employment. The final German surrender, on May 8, 1945, came as relief to soldiers on both sides, but the Katyusha's terror would echo through the post-war decades in ways that transcended its direct military impact. German veterans returning home carried psychological scars that manifested in unexpected ways. Studies conducted in the 1950s and 60s by German medical researchers documented persistent auditory sensitivity among Eastern Front veterans. Men who had adapted to peacetime life, who showed no other obvious symptoms of combat trauma, would experience severe anxiety responses to certain sounds. Air raid sirens, industrial machinery, even fireworks could trigger panic attacks in men who had been exposed to repeated Katyusha attacks during the war. The weapon's post-war legacy extended into Cold War military doctrine. NATO forces studying Soviet military capabilities recognized that the rocket artillery doctrine developed during World War II remained central to Soviet operational planning. Warsaw Pact. Exercises in the 1950s and 60s featured massed rocket artillery fires that echoed the tactics used against German forces. Western military planners developed countermeasures based partly on analysis of German experiences, emphasizing mobility and dispersion to reduce vulnerability to saturation fire. The shadow of the Katyusha influenced military thinking decades after the weapon itself had been superseded by more sophisticated systems. Soviet veterans' accounts of Katyusha employment provided a counterpoint to German narratives of terror. For Soviet soldiers, the rocket launchers represented hope, a weapon that embodied their industrial strength and capacity to defeat the invaders. The nickname Katyusha, derived from a popular wartime song about a girl waiting for her soldier to return, reflected affection that contrasted sharply with the German terror. Soviet propaganda elevated the weapon to near-mythical status, featuring it in films, posters, and literature as a symbol of Soviet military prowess. The disconnect between how the two sides perceived the same weapon illustrated the fundamental asymmetry of the Eastern Front experience. The human cost of the Eastern Front's industrial warfare remains difficult to comprehend. Soviet military casualties exceeded 8 million, killed with millions more wounded. German military casualties exceeded 3 million killed in the East alone. Civilian casualties on both sides numbered in the tens of millions. The Katyusha's contribution to this carnage was significant, but impossible to calculate precisely. The weapon killed and wounded hundreds of thousands directly. Its psychological impact degraded German combat effectiveness in ways that contributed indirectly to Soviet tactical successes that produced additional casualties. The weapon's mere presence forced German tactical adaptations that reduced efficiency and increased vulnerability to other threats. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner survived the war, returned to Munich in June 1945. The city he had left as a confident young officer in 1939 was now 70% destroyed, its population reduced by half, its economy shattered. Steiner spent the post-war years working in reconstruction, helping rebuild the physical infrastructure that Allied bombing and Soviet artillery had destroyed. But he never fully escaped the psychological impact of that morning at Orsha in July 1941, when he first heard the shrieking of Katyusha rockets and watched half his battalion disappear in flames. In interviews conducted in the 1970s for a documentary about the Eastern Front, Steiner spoke with remarkable candor about how that experience had shaped his understanding of the war. He described feeling not just fear but profound disorientation when confronted with a weapon that made all his training and experience seem irrelevant. The Wehrmacht had trained him to be a professional soldier, to lead men through tactical situations using skill and courage. The Katyusha made skill irrelevant and courage meaningless. Survival became random, dependent on whether rockets happened to land near your position or elsewhere. This randomness, Steiner said, was more psychologically devastating than any amount of danger that could be influenced by individual action. Steiner's reflection captured something essential about the Katyusha's strategic impact beyond casualty counts and tactical effects. The weapon challenged German soldiers' self-conception as professional warriors whose skill and discipline gave them advantage over numerically superior but supposedly inferior Soviet forces. When a crude weapon operated by minimally trained crews could annihilate experienced German units regardless of their tactical proficiency, it forced recognition that the war was not being decided by individual or unit-level factors, but by industrial and strategic forces beyond individual influence. This recognition was psychologically crushing in ways that simple military defeat was not. The post-war scholarship on the Katyusha has produced consensus around several key conclusions. First, the weapon represented successful weaponization of industrial capacity through appropriate design philosophy that matched production capabilities with tactical requirements. Second, its psychological impact exceeded its material effects, making it strategically valuable beyond simple firepower calculations. Third, its employment validated Soviet military doctrine, emphasizing mass and shock over precision and efficiency. Fourth, German failure to develop effective countermeasures reflected broader strategic problems that contributed to German defeat on the Eastern Front. These academic conclusions, while accurate, somewhat abstract the human experience of both using and being targeted by the weapon. For Soviet soldiers like Sergeant Ivan Petrov, the Katyusha represented power, the ability to strike, back against invaders with devastating effect. For German soldiers like Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, it represented helplessness, the recognition that individual courage and skill could not overcome industrial and material superiority. These contrasting experiences reflected the fundamental asymmetry of the Eastern Front War, where Soviet acceptance of massive casualties and focus on quantitative superiority eventually overwhelmed German tactical excellence and technical sophistication. The Katyusha's final legacy is perhaps best understood not through strategic analysis or casualty statistics, but through the memories of those who heard its distinctive shriek. That sound, mechanical and inhuman, announced a form of warfare that would define the remainder of the 20th century. Wars between industrial powers would be decided not primarily by tactical brilliance or individual heroism, but by production capacity, logistics, and the ability to translate industrial might into battlefield effects. The rocket launcher, mounted on an ordinary truck, represented this new reality more effectively than any amount of technical sophistication could have done. German soldiers heard the Katyusha's scream and knew they were facing something their training had not prepared them for, something that made their professional skills inadequate, something that would contribute to their ultimate defeat. That moment of recognition, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of soldiers in thousands of engagements over 4 years of war, contributed to the psychological collapse that accompanied Germany's military defeat. The weapon's material effects were significant. Its psychological effects were devastating. Together, they made the Katyusha one of World War II's most influential weapon systems, despite its technical crudity. The story that began at Orsha in July 1941, with Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner watching in disbelief as shrieking rockets obliterated half his battalion, represents more than tactical surprise or technological innovation. It represents the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, one emphasizing quality and sophistication, the other emphasizing quantity and simplicity. The outcome of this collision demonstrated that in industrial-age warfare between great powers, quantity properly employed can overcome quality. The 320 rockets that erased a German battalion in 2 minutes announced this principle with a shriek that would echo through the remainder of the war and far beyond. The story that began at Orsha in July 1941, with Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner watching in disbelief as shrieking rockets obliterated half his battalion, represents more than tactical surprise or technological innovation. It represents the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, one emphasizing quality and sophistication, the other emphasizing quantity and simplicity. The outcome of this collision demonstrated that in industrial age warfare between great powers, quantity properly employed can overcome quality. The 320 rockets that erased a German battalion in 2 minutes announced this principle with a shriek that would echo through the remainder of the war and far beyond into the decades of Cold War military planning that followed. The weapon German soldiers feared above all others was neither the most accurate nor the most efficient, but it was perhaps the most effective symbol of the industrial might that would ultimately decide the war's outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.